Throwback Thursday. Sorry, I nearly just showed you the album cover. So Throwback Thursday, I've been talking about TV shows, I've been talking about artists, and I'm now talking about music albums. And so with this, I'm going to talk about my third favourite album, which influences me as a musician and something I love personally. It's this album by Love, a group from LA from 1967. Yeah, 67, yeah, get it right, yeah, 67. And the album is called Forever Changes. Now this album, it's quite a big range difference from the first two albums I spoke about, which was Michael Jackson's Thriller from the 80s, probably one of the pop mega hits of the 80s. And then Hear My Dear, probably one of the most interesting concept albums from the 70s. This album is also a concept album, but not a concept album, if you get what I mean. Arthur Lee, this genius here, was a guy who was brought up in Watts, saw the riots in the 60s, very much an interesting guy, introspective guy, and Love were one of San Francisco's best bands. The issue with Love is that they wouldn't go touring because Arthur Lee was afraid of planes, he was afraid of travel, he was very prophetic in how he saw things, so he was always worried of this. Actually, in the late 90s, early 2000s, he did eventually tour with an orchestra, I think, Forever Changes. I got to manage to see that when I was at university, got to see him perform it live. Imagine it in the 60s must have been even more epic because the band were great. So, this album, why do I love it? Well, many reasons. It is an album which was released in 1967, but the issue with that was because it was released in the 60s, it was after the time of the Flower Power era and the Summer of Love. And this album is not that. This album is about the idea of where life goes. Where does it lead? Where is the idea of what is going to happen in the world? And Arthur Lee talks about this in many ways. He explains about the idea of the world, the dangers of it, the dangers of the scene in San Francisco, how he explains about how he's uncomfortable with the different things going on in his band. In fact, this was the last time of this carnation of Love. It wasn't working for him, so I do apologise. Sorry, I was trying to put the record in. It's so tight. This is so old because it's from the 60s, and it keeps. I don't want it to break the album. So anyway, this band, Arthur Lee is the main vocalist, and the sub-vocalist. And if you look at the band's quite a mixed race, quite unusual. It actually caused a lot of tension when they were trying to tour as well in the US, because as you can see, Brian McLean, who was the guitarist and vocalist, was white, and two of the other members are white, and then the other guy, who is Michael Stewart, is this guy here, who's black. So Arthur Lee, being some places where they would perform, they were in San Francisco and LA, it was seen as fine because it was less segregated because of being in the hippie movement and the rest of it, but in the rest of the time he didn't know how people would accept him. Before this album was released, because it was produced by Arthur Lee and Bruce Botnick, Botnick was already working with a group called The Doors, and Arthur Lee introduced The Doors to Bruce Botnick and the Elektra Company. And a lot of it was with The Doors. They were just more marketable. They were easier to work with. Jim Morrison also was had a very much an aura about him. Arthur Lee was a bit more complicated and a bit more troubled. So this idea of Forever Changes with Love was Arthur Lee had come up with these songs, and these are like poems. In fact, what's quite interesting is all the titles are like statements about the time, not actually the song. There's actually some of the song titles really weird. It's because not one of them mentions the song title in the songs. The choruses are unconventional. They have an orchestra playing the which is like some of the stuff, and the trumpets and the horns sounds like mariachi band stuff. It's very much an LA album, but it's got this feeling of understanding of life. It sort of questions us in our own lives. And I think the first time I heard this album, I was about 7-8 years old, and that's actually how I got this. I just, funny enough, my thing was I loved the album cover. I thought, cool, that's a cool album cover, and thought, okay, let me buy it. And it was very cheap. I mean, I think I got it at a boot sale for like £2. Ridiculous. This album's are now, it's in the 60s, are now worth 50, 60 quid. But the one thing is with this album, it's, to mention it, it is about political statements. So Alone Again Or was written by Brian McLean, and it's the only song. There's 2 songs he sings. He sings Alone Again and Old Man. And Brian McLean was very much about flowers and stuff like that, and he was very very flower power. He was very psychedelic in that respect. Arthur Lee was more political. So it's kind of like Arthur Lee was going, if he would say he'd worked with Sly and the Family Stone, he would probably become like Sly and the Stone, becoming the Black Panther movement and all the rest of it. But he didn't. He always kind of kept it restrained. And I think he'd also got sick of the San Francisco scene of how it kind of got commercialised as well. So Alone Again Or by Brian McLean, he's talking about this idea of how they all feel and where they feel are in who they are as people and how they're trying to work together. The band got together due to that the Arthur Lee had done these songs and they got a backing band. It was Neil Young's backing band, and it didn't work. None of them liked it, and the band hated how they'd done the arrangements. So they went, nope, we're going to come in and do it properly. So Alone Again Or is this idea of where people are trying to understand who their scene is around. A House Is Not a Hotel, which is the motel, which is the second track, is they used to live in a place called the Castle, and this is where the band lived, and obviously some of them were getting into heroin and drug addicts, but also people would be squatters. They would just like be hippies staying there, and it ended up that this house wasn't their place anymore. It was like, it just felt like these people were just intruding in them, trying to be part of a scene. And Arthur Lee's talking about this, how he feels really uncomfortable with this. And then Andmoreagain, he's talking about this idea, in this poetic idea of how he feels about life, where it should go to. The Daily Planet, which is about the idea of Daily Planet. He's talking about the Earth and the different issues of Earth and what's going on in the wars and how the world is working. But also the Daily Planet is a pun on the idea of the news and how over dramatised everything is. Old Man, which Brian McLean sings, is about this idea that this old man is trying to explain the simplicity of life and how these hippies have now taken their lives to a point that it's actually now gone it to the other side. And it's probably one of the first albums which is talking about the idea of idealism, of how you can sometimes make idealism but it actually doesn't work. It's kind of, there's a negative slant on it, and it's all the time when you're listening to it, you kind of see, it's like when people see the Summer of Love in 1966 with rose-tinted glasses, this is probably seeing it in like black shades, not wanting to see it. And I think this is why this album is really interesting. The Red Telephone, which is about this idea of the nuclear threat, which was always talked about at that time. Then on the side 2, the start off is Maybe the People would be the times or between Clark and Hilldale. Clark and Hilldale was an area which was a big hill in San Francisco, and this is where all the music scene was happening. And it's also got this idea of, again, this idea of this mariachi band and stuff. So it's also the idea of how Arthur Lee's talking about how LA became such a white place of taking over when they got all these cultures, because if you've got to remember, LA, Los Angeles actually was originally Mexican. So he's kind of talking about this conflict of how the land has been taken and commercialised, and he's talking about colonialism in a sort of a weird way. Live and Let Live, he's talking about the idea of how to have peace and understanding. The Good Human Man, he sees everything like this again. And the Bummer in the Summer, is this idea of instead of the idea of summer love and all this stuff, is he just sees this Summer of Love as just ending up being something which is going to go chaotic. And actually it does, because after the Summer of Love was basically like the winter of discontent, which is where a lot of the people in the Summer of Love, then from taking marijuana and being Woodstock and everything and seeing the idealism, then turns into people getting into heroin and then becoming depressed and more melancholic. And so he kind of saw this change, and he wrote about it in this way. And You Set the Scene, which is the last track, which is a really good track, is talking about him. He's talking about how he set that scene in San Francisco of this kind of psychedelic rock, and it was, Sly Stone set his up, but Arthur Lee created the other one. So without Arthur Lee, you would never have the Doors. So as you set the scene, he's kind of talking about this idea of where he created this, but he finds that he wants to reject it because it's become too commercial. It's been commercialized. It's been taken away from it. It's lost the artistry of it. So Arthur Lee, as a writer, like Marvin Gaye from Hear My Dear, it's like this very personal way of working. In fact, Arthur Lee said that the reason he wrote the album was because he actually felt he was going to die within a year, because he just saw the way the world was imploding on itself. And this is from 1966-67. So you kind of got to look at it and think, wow, was the 60s as ideal as it was? Well, if you listen to this album, you would believe it is not. And my mum, she was born in 1947, so by 67 she was 20. So her music in the 60s was very upbeat and so forth. And then there was the Beatles, but it was always that after 66 there was this Summer of Love and all this stuff, and then the music started changing, become a lot more depressive, a lot more reflective, probably more political as well. Maybe the influence of psychedelic, the drugs from India, the way people behaved. I know there's a lot of things where even George Harrison had got sick of the hippie movement, of how it became so commercialised. And I think that with Glastonbury as well, and some other events, that how they utilise that idea and then it become something where it's being commercialised. And it's always this problem with music and artistry, is that to make money, you should be able to just do your art in the way it works, but without promotion and way of marketing and how these record companies take over, same as films and everything else, it's like it becomes a commercial commodity. And I think Arthur Lee in this record is trying to talk about that. I think it is. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think that's what I get from the album. And as a kid listening to this album, it kind of made me look at the world probably in a different angle. I kind of saw it as, I understood it and resonated with it. And there's actually a reason for that, but I'll explain that in another spiritual video about my past life regressions. But with this album, I think as an album, if you want to understand the 60s and not hear it in this upbeat, cheery way, but hearing it from the reflective ideal, this album is excellent for that. And I think every time I've ever recommended this album to anyone, they fall in love with it and want to buy it. In fact, I've had 3 other copies which I've sold of this album. I've had so many people want to buy this one as well. And it is just, but this one I've kept because I don't think it's an original. I think it's like a reproduction, but I used to play this a lot, and actually it was only until the early 2000s they actually did Forever Changes became known more on CD. So it wasn't so commercially available. So having this on record was very unusual. And then once I got it on CD, that was then an album I played a lot. And it probably was one of the most influential albums out of the first 3. And still, I love parts of it. So, but I'm going to talk about some more 60s albums, which are not sort of people talk. And again, I won't be talking about the Beatles only. I'm going to talk about Donovan and his influence on British folk music and so forth. Another group is the Moody Blues. I'm going to be talking about an album they did, which was the first album with an orchestra, and how it's actually got a concept album. It's like tone poems, really clever album. And then I'm going to talk about some other groups in that time. So the 60s to me had some very influential artists, because it's where really we call it the pop revolution. That's when it really started. Due to the Beatles and the Mersey sound coming over to America, and then obviously America, the LA, San Francisco sound came up with their own thing. So please stay tuned, and the next albums I should be talking about won't be 60s albums of yet. They're going to be talking more about 70s albums and some other ideas.